According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the United States, with one person dying from it every 34 seconds. It claims more lives every year than all forms of cancer and chronic lower respiratory disease combined, according to the American Heart Association. While many culprits can be found in assessing the disease causes and progression, over the recent years, nutrition and the gut microbiome have been increasingly identified in the cause and progression of these diseases, including atherosclerosis, hypertension, and heart failure. Our special guest this evening, Dr. Kim Williams, will help us better understand this relationship. Evening, everyone. I'm Jim Spellos from Planned Parenthood Metro New York, and welcome to this episode of Heart to Healthy Heart. Before we dive into the core of the episode, on behalf of my co-host Ben Martins, we want to express our deepest sympathies to our other co-host, Judith Zerden, whose father just passed away. In honor of Judith and her father, this episode is dedicated to them and to all of us as we try to better understand how to add life to our years and helpfully add years to our life. As always, we encourage you to use the chat box to tell us where you are viewing from, as well as to ask any questions of our guest. We will have plenty of time for questions, so please start asking them right now. And at this point, let me introduce our special guest. Dr. Kim Williams is currently the chairman of the Department of Medicine at the University of Louisville. He specializes in cardiology, cardionutrition, cardiorheumatology, cardionephrology, preventive cardiology, and cardiovascular radiology. He's a past president of the American College of Cardiology, as well as the American Society of Nuclear Cardiology, and a former chairman of the board of directors of the Association of Black Cardiologists. He's the founder of the Urban Cardiology Initiative in Detroit, aiming to reduce ethnic heart care disparities, and continued community-based efforts in Chicago at Rush, including the HEART program, that stands for Helping Everyone Assess Risk Today. Dr. Williams, I can read the rest of your bio, but I think we'd be here for the full 30 minutes. So why don't I just say welcome and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you had mentioned in your initial, in the bio about nutrition and the gut microbiome. And I think a good place to start for us tonight would be to figure out what those actually have to do with cardiovascular health.
So it's really amazing. You can look around the room, wherever you are, and you'll be surprised to find out that the person sitting next to you is not human. You are, but they are not. The majority of the cells in our body are actually not human. It's about 43% human, and the rest are all these other microorganisms. And that's if you do it by cell count. If you do it by a number of gene pairs, it's actually 20 million to 20,000. We only have 20,000 genes that are human, and the rest of the genes in our body belong to other organisms. And so this, where we're going to end up with this, with a little bit of explanation, is the fact that we actually have opportunities to change what kind of microorganisms are populating our bodies, and that it makes the difference between all kinds of diseases. You mentioned some in the introduction, heart disease, heart failure, and the like, but it's also kidney disease. It's also neurologic disease. And in fact, the major concerns that we have as medical practitioners of things that we find so difficult, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, are all controlled or influenced by the microbiome and how the neural signaling happens depending on what kinds of bacteria and fungi and everything else you have inside your body. So it turns out that for cardiovascular disease, it's very clear that there are bacteria in your GI tract that can promote gut behavior that will absorb more calories and make you obese. And there are ones that change the biochemical nature of the food that you're digesting, that you end up absorbing more calories, more fatty acids, more inflammatory markers are developed by bacteria in the GI tract, by some of them, and others are not. And so the ones that are healthy for you, that promote blood pressure normality, can help you get rid of cholesterol, can lower the tendency toward diabetes, and more importantly, in the dual pandemic. You mentioned the one pandemic, heart disease being the leading killing of Americans since 1918, when it was taken out for 1 year by the Spanish flu. COVID didn't do that. COVID almost took us out, but not quite. And so, but COVID really is the second pandemic on top of the first pandemic. And it turns out that people who have the good microbiome, the good bacteria in their GI tract, actually have a much better outcome. There's lower inflammatory markers, and can't imagine that lay people would know the term cytokine storm. But we all know that now because of, and it's produced by the bacteria in the GI tract. And so it was not a wonder when the data came out very clearly last October in the British Medical Journal that people who have a plant-based diet have a 73% lower likelihood of having moderate to severe COVID illness. And I'm sure there's some vegan who died of COVID, but I keep asking, and no one has ever, I haven't seen one, and no one's reporting it. So everyone's saying, vegans don't die of COVID, and therefore we don't have to get the vaccine. Hopefully that's been completely demolished. Everyone understands that the vegans are the ones who need the vaccine the most because they're going to catch it and not know it. There's a higher incidence of asymptomatic COVID, meaning that you're spreading it. And, the vaccine doesn't really necessarily, particularly as the variants go, doesn't necessarily stop you from catching it, but it can lower the amount of illness that you have. We do see lower spread with a shorter duration of the illness. So you end up with less sick time and less spread time. So let's all be really safe. Do a whole food plant-based diet, do your vaccinations and the boosters, and we can help with both pandemics. So anyway, that's a lot of literature summarized in a brief period of time. But the bottom line is that it's all controlled by the microbiome.
Truly amazing. And this research really wasn't around 15, 20 years ago. Would that be correct?
That's right. It actually did start, probably the papers that I was pulling about diabetes, for example, and hypertension. Some of these are, 2017. There's a good 5 years of solid work on it, where it's been in the cardiovascular arena. It's been in the neurologic arena a little longer, but it's not getting, it's more recently that people are recognizing the power of changing your microbiome. Taking the, everyone is, not everyone, but many people have heard that you can get, after a hospitalization, Clostridium difficile, C. diff, they call it, where you end up, had some antibiotics and they knocked out your gut flora, and you end up with this horrific diarrheal illness, 20 bowel movements a day. It's really tough. Well, one of the best treatments for it is to get your spouse to give you stool. So they started doing fecal transplants. Well, it turns out this fecal transplant thing is actually getting to be a big deal. And you can actually take a thin person, give them the feces by transplant of an obese person, and they gain weight. And the reverse is true as well, because the microbiome controls all of that.
Does this happen quickly if they were to do a fecal transplant? Is that like an automatic reaction the body has?
So these are usually kind of the short-term experiments. So I don't have really long-term outcomes. I would love to see it, but I would say that the best data that we have about probiotics is actually prebiotic, and the prebiotic stands for the food that you're eating. And so you can change your own microbiome just by eating. If you try to avoid, I hate to say a sort of a gross or unacceptable term, but the decaying flesh of an animal, if you don't do that, you end up with a better set of microbiome, because whole grains, for example, produce or promote the growth of really good bacteria that lower all your cardiovascular risk. And that's why you see this association. We're stumbling around saying, oh, whole grains are good for you. Oh, cutting the amount of saturated fat, cutting cholesterol out of your diet. But we didn't really have the mechanisms. We thought we knew. But it turns out that the microbiome really isn't controllable. It wasn't that we were saying things that were wrong. We just didn't have the whole picture of why that's so right.
Ben, I know you had a question about the microbiome and personalized nutrition. It'd be a good time to ask that now, I think.
Yes. First of all, a very interesting topic, the microbiome. One of our today's trends is personalized nutrition. With your knowledge of the gut microbiome, do you think that there will come a time when a personalized diet will help us reduce cardiovascular mortality? Or do you think this is just more a hype and a marketing hope than fact?
Well, I would never want to say hype until the randomized prospective long-term outcome trials are done to pass judgment one way or the other. But I would say that a lot of what's been done for personalized approaches has fallen through. I mean, we were having genetic approaches to like ACE inhibitors for hypertension years ago, and it turns out that didn't work. Then we had our anti-clotting agents, the clopidogrel. Oh, it's a prodrug. You have to have the genetic capability to turn it into the real drug. And therefore, choosing those drugs based on genes, that didn't work either. And so I, with a little bit of skepticism about personalized diets, I know I see a lot of it on the internet. I haven't seen a convincing randomized trial, but that just means that they have to do them. It could be that this is exactly what we're supposed to do. I don't know that the genome, I mean, we are human, and the differences genetically between humans is so incredibly small. We're all basically the same organism. And so the idea that we're going to have major differences in how we respond to our own microbiome, that's something that it would be a good theory to test, and we'd have to try it. So I would think the best thing to do is to make sure that you're not eating the things that are going to harm your microbiome. That would be refined grains, sugars, the sugar sweetened beverages, the animal products, and then make sure that we're doing things that are going to promote a good microbiome, fresh fruits and vegetables, and whole grains.
So a question about risk itself is, how do we assess our cardiovascular risk, especially if we haven't had anything happen to us? Now, Ben and I are both in situations we have known issues that have happened to both of us. But for someone who's been fortunate enough to stay away from that, what can they do? Where can they go? What should they be doing?
So 3 letters, ACC, the American College of Cardiology. And so we do partner with the American Heart Association on many things. One of them is absolutely the risk calculator. And so if you don't have the risk calculator for your phone, you really should. You can, no matter what kind, iPhone, Android, or whatever, you should be able to go on there and look for the ACC AHA risk calculator. Now, what do you do with that? You download it, it's free. And next time you're at the family gathering, Uncle Joe, tell me your last cholesterol, and you put it in there. And what's your blood pressure, and how old are you now? And you put everything in there, and it tells you what your 10-year risk of heart attack, stroke, and death would be. And then you get a number. And if that number is less than 5%, you're probably doing okay. Change to a whole food, plant-based diet, exercise every day, and make sure you're getting sleep, and you're going to do okay. If you're above 5%, you have to consider whether or not you have some excess risks, such as a family member who had that is a primary family member who had a cardiac event below age 60. And then, or you've got a funny type of cholesterol, such as LP little a, or you've had one of these advanced cholesterol tests and there's something wrong. And when you find out one of those things, even at 5% risk, you ought to be considering more testing and even treatment of whatever risk factors you had, especially cholesterol. At 7.5%, we say, okay, that's it. You really need to be on something. And the one way to get out of it, because there are people who don't want to take medication, don't want to, do anything other than, natural stuff, which works for so many, but not everyone. One of the things that you could do is do a coronary calcium score. And it's not available absolutely everywhere, but a publication that we had, you can Google it if you're interested in it, says that if you are unfortunately in a socioeconomically depressed area, you may not have a hospital that does a coronary calcium score. That's sad, and hopefully we can do something about that with legislation or regulation or something. But most places do have a, come on, walk up, ask them if you could pay your $50 or your $100 and get a calcium score. That score is not perfect, but it's darn good. So-called power of zero. If you have a 0 calcium score, the odds of, according to the MESA trial, if the odds of you having a cardiac event in the next 10 years is extremely small. And so you're not cardiac immortal, but we use that phrase all the time anyway. And then if the score is low, then you need to see your doctor. By guidelines, you would need cholesterol lowering medicine if you have LDL cholesterol is greater than 55. And I'm sorry, it's higher than 55. And it typically was done with a statin because they're very effective. You don't need aspirin though if your score is less than 100, because aspirin has its own little bleeding risk, and we don't really want to take a chance with that. On the other hand, if it's more than 100, score is more than 100, you really should be on the aspirin and the statin. So these are, and I would say, I would add one more layer that goes along with our guidelines, is that you should consider some diagnostic testing if you have an extremely high score, whether it's 400. Some people would draw the line at 1,000, wherever. And that probably is going to have to be individualized for the person. But if your calcium score is really high, you might actually consider having a stress test.
For a layperson, that calcium score is calcified plaque in the arteries. Is that what it's identifying?
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing that you're pointing out, Jim, is that yes, when you develop plaque, your cholesterol has been too high. It gets in the wall of your artery, and it can give you a heart attack, or it can grow to the point where it's obstructing the artery, or it could be perfectly stable. And the way to get to stable, believe it or not, is calcium. And so the calcium score is actually reflecting the stable plaque that'll never give you a heart attack. And so why do we worry about a high calcium score? Because of the plaque next to it. If you have a high plaque burden, the fact that you have a lot of calcification means it's going on for a while. You have a lot of it, it's healing, but you've got some unhealed, and that needs to be taken care of. And that's why we have guidelines for getting your LDL cholesterol, your inflammation, every risk factor that's going to promote more plaque, you want to get that to go away.
So you mentioned nutrition. Obviously, this is a channel that talks a lot about that. Is there such a thing as a superfood for cardiovascular health?
So I would say there's a super pattern. Okay. You mentioned hype earlier. There are a lot of foods, for example, that lower cholesterol, everything from avocados to Brazil nuts to psyllium fiber. There are so many things out there. And I guess you could call each one of those a superfood in terms of being able to lower cholesterol, lower inflammation. And to the extent that that's what we're talking about, great. I would say that it's not that cholesterol and inflammation are everything, but they're pretty close. If I had to throw one other thing in there, it's TMAO, trimethylamine N oxide. But when you're doing a whole food plant-based diet, you're not getting the TMAO levels. And so just worrying about inflammation and LDL become the primary targets to reduce. And anything that lowers those things is super, as far as I'm concerned.
Ben, I know you had a question about TMAO, so perfect time to just jump right into that.
Yeah, how can we apply the current knowledge regarding TMAO and the microbiome to improve our heart and our gut and heart health?
It's really important to understand the connection between what Cleveland Clinic started talking about a decade ago, particularly red meat and processed red meat. We've had the data for a long time that red meat kills and processed red meat kills faster, that they're associated with coronary disease and stroke and heart failure and death. And we've had all this data, and we have even large-scale outcomes trials, 30 years of observational data, Harvard, Loma Linda. And, we have so much data that says that red meat is harmful. And yet we continue to promote it. Television commercials, nutrition schools. I really get into big battles with our dialysis units, trying to saying that, the patients in the kidney who have kidney failure are catabolic and they need a lot of protein. Well, if they're eating a protein that's going to make their cardiovascular system worse, that's really not going to help them long term. And TMAO is really in the middle of that. It has to do with the microbiome. And if you have a really good gut microbiome, you don't develop the TMAO at nearly the rate that other people would. And the way you control that is to change the diet. And, people are thinking of ways of, probiotics that will change the microbiome and allow you to eat whatever you want, and or enzyme blockers so that you don't oxidize the trimethylamine. And you could go around all of these mechanisms and taking more pills, but why not just change the diet to the whole food plant-based diet that doesn't give you the components that generate the TMAO in the first place?
Well, that's far too easy. Obviously, changing the diet just would be a simple solution, right? We have a lot of questions coming in. So let me just get one that just came in about why do you think that the whole food, plant-based SOS way of eating is still perceived as radical by society, given the overwhelming of evidence that you've just shared and in general in the literature?
So you're asking the what I think is the multi-trillion-dollar question. That is, we have a healthcare system that is going bankrupt. And I keep getting different words over time from the Medicare trustees, whether it's 2026, 25, or 24, that Medicare is going to go bankrupt. But they have mapped out what that means. It's about a 30% reduction in payments to facilities and physicians. That's going to set up a crisis. And obviously, we're going to have to deal with that crisis the way we dealt with the COVID crisis. And there'll have to be more expenditures, have to blow up the system. But while this being fixed, my concern is access to care and what's going to happen to people. And so we could continue the way we're doing things right now. And if we actually have a publication on television commercials, and if you look at the grade of the food and whether or not it's promoting mortality or health, you'd be shocked. But you just stare at the next time you see a food commercial and see what's in it. And you'll see refined grains and animal products with high cholesterol, high saturated fat, high sodium. And so it's a critical issue. A lot of it's financially motivated. People will criticize grocery stores in our Black community saying, oh, this is a food desert, you don't have healthy food. Well, isn't that because they're in business to sell things and they will sell what people buy? So we have to fix ourselves first. And so education programs are going to be very helpful. And I can tell you that our White House administration has, for the first time in 50 years, decided to do an evaluation of this and put on a conference. It'll be in the end of September, the conference on nutrition, health, hunger. And I'm hoping that there will be recommendations. I'm on one of the subcommittees to sort of make some recommendations to them. Whether they'll adopt them or not, I obviously don't know. But we're trying to say that let's change the marketing. Let's change the food subsidies so that whole food plant-based diet that avoids salt, oil, excessive oil and sugar. We're not subsidizing the production of those things, and let's subsidize the whole concept of whole food plant-based diet, making sure that our agriculture is changing from animal husbandry to the other side to do whole food plant-based production. I think this is a critical time. I don't want to go too far away from what the question was saying, but it's hard to sit here comfortably and know what's happening in so many parts of the Southwest with the fires. And in London, I just left London a couple of weeks ago, and to see what's going on over there, and for people to suddenly start taking global warming seriously. And we have a lot of hybrid car. I drive a hybrid car. But the idea that people will be concerned about carbon emissions and buy an electric car and then go eat a steak, when methane is 23 times more powerful at destroying the environment than carbon dioxide is, I would say that we have every reason to do what the questioner is asking: change to a whole food plant-based diet and see if we can make our planet better, our country better, our communities better, ourselves better. And so, but getting people to avoid the allure of things that look good, taste good, because it's in our culture and in our minds, is very hard. And the behavior is hard.
It's tough. And you mentioned early on in that statement, the food score. I could never even imagine on commercials and on TV any sort of legitimate score that would say, eat your brand X cereal. It has a food score of -27. I mean, that's essentially what would happen. We've had a couple of questions about the microbiome, and you talked about that earlier. So is there a blood test that can determine a healthy microbiome, or is the fecal transplant that you mentioned the only way, or are there other ways?
It's actually a poop test. So the microbiome actually is measured. There are everyone, not everyone, but most people have heard that there's little cards for stool blood sample, and they go home and they take a little sample of the stool and put it on the card and mail it back in. And it's not something that most people find pleasant, but that same sort of thing can be done for the microbiome. And I'm hoping that all of our labs are going to gear up to do this kind of testing on a routine basis.
It would be absolutely incredible if that was to happen now. Someone wants to know about time frame. regarding changing to a whole food plant-based diet, and how long might it take for a person to change the diet and start to see the metrics improve?
Oh, absolutely. And so we always talk about 2 weeks because the blood pressure tends to fall. And I should just say that these things are really powerful. I have several times in my career convinced a patient to go on a whole food plant-based diet. And I always tell them to watch your blood pressure. You're on 3 different blood pressure medicines. You're going to have to come off some of them. And invariably, that one patient will sort of not do the blood pressures. They'll do the diet, they'll do the exercise, and they won't monitor their blood pressure. And then they start feeling bad. And then they've checked their blood pressure and it's 80/60 because they're taking medication for a disease they don't have anymore. And that can really happen within a couple of weeks. And so it turns out that the microbiome does have about a 2-week time frame, but the changes start in the first 4 days. And so these changes can happen very quickly. And we've seen some very dramatic results in terms of cholesterol lowering, blood pressure lowering, weight lowering, and people feeling much better in terms of energy and being able to get around and live their lives.
With the cholesterol lowering, a lot of people, especially people who eat whole food plant-based, find that their HDL is too low for their cardiologist comfort level. Is there any issue with it being too low, especially if their LDL and their triglycerides and all those other markers are low as well?
So please ask their cardiologist to Google the words HDL and mortality, and they'll see the data from the last 3 years that are unequivocally show that we had it wrong, that high HDL is associated with higher mortality. It's hard to just talk about things that we had wrong for 60 years. But that's the fact. And that's, medical knowledge doubles every 73 days. And we just have to accept the fact that probably everything I learned in medical school was wrong, but I learned how to learn. So I'm still glad that I went. But the factual things just keep changing. And that's one of the major things in cardiology. Now, there is still an association between low HDL and mortality, but as an independent risk factor, because when you're eating a sugar-filled saturated or a sugar-filled diet, that will lower your HDL. And so all of the stuff that we did in the past to show that low HDL was bad for you really needs to be redone with enough of the confounding variables measured to know that it has an independent effect. And so so all of the things that we used to work on, I could rattle them off for you: niacin, the fibric acid derivatives, the torcetrapib, anacetrapib, dalcetrapib, all of these attempts at raising HDL failed. They all increased mortality a little bit or did something not good. The fibrates didn't increase cardiovascular mortality, but they did increase overall mortality. So what was the point? And so I would say that we want to avoid things that artificially are going to raise the HDL other than exercise, which is really good. And try to control that LDL. And if your triglycerides are more than 150, that needs to be addressed as well. And so I just throw this in here because the parallel question comes in about people going on a plant-based diet and their triglycerides going up. Well, that typically means that you're doing those vegan beignets and those vegan donuts and those vegan ice cream, and the allure is there, but it turns out that a unhealthy plant-based diet is a little worse, according to an article published in 2017 in the Journal of American College of Cardiology, is a little worse than eating animals. And so I tease my colleagues who are vegan for like animal rights and the good, and planet, and that it's really good for the planet to eat that kind of stuff because you don't have to worry about the greenhouse gases, and it gets rid of humans.
Amazing stuff. What's also amazing is we are almost out of time, but there was one question that came in that I think really put a bow on everything, and it's from one of our viewers. If there were 3 things to take away from tonight, what would they be?
Number one, let's pay attention to what's being marketed. Let's get everyone to understand the power of a whole food plant-based diet. Let's do this at the community level and change the marketing because we've changed what we decide to buy. Let's take this very seriously because it's critical for our healthcare financing to get rid of chronic diseases, and it's critical for our planet as well.
That says it absolutely all. One other question, since it just came in, and I want to just get to it. Of course, I'm clicking on stuff right here. People want to know personal favorites. Do you have a personal favorite heart healthy dish?
Oh my gosh! You caught me unaware there. Anything that's whole food, plant-based diet, but and so I may not be the right person to ask that question because my diet is driven solely by literature. For example, I really hated avocados, and there are some vegan diets that say avocados aren't good for you. And then all of a sudden, there were 2 trials published in the last 6 months. One saying that it lowered LDL cholesterol 15%, but to eat them regularly. And the other one showed an increase in longevity with avocado consumption. So all of a sudden, my taste buds love avocados. It's like I'm programmed for medical literature somehow in my likes and dislikes. So, but I would say anything in the whole food plant-based diet tastes really great.
And a couple of online resources that people might need to know about. You gave us the ACC risk calculator. Anything else? Because part of the problem that we all have is there's way too much noise out there. So where do you go? Where should we go?
Please, I'm so glad you asked. Number one would be the cookbook from the Association of Black Cardiologists. It's called Heart and Soul Cookbook. And it is a bunch of recipes that are designed to be exciting and yet whole food plant-based. I'm an author, but that's because it was my idea. All of the hard work was done by Keith Ferdinand's wife, Daphne Ferdinand. Keith Ferdinand's a longtime ABC leader. And Baxter Montgomery Health in Houston. And it's a fantastic resource. It's there on a PDF. You can print it out. You can give it to all your friends. It would be absolutely wonderful. And so the other one I would say is something that I actually did write, and that is the ACC AHA 2019 Prevention Guidelines. Section 3.1 has the entire discussion of nutrition. And people will criticize the guideline because it got a little fishy by the time I was outvoted in the room, and what I wrote was modified. But to give credit to fish, it doesn't raise your TMAO level very much typically, and it's a whole lot better than red meat. So that substitutionary benefit comes out in randomized trials enough that it ends up swimming into the guidelines. But those 5 recommendations that are there are things that every person should bring to their doctor, because what we're finding is that the leading cause of death of doctors, including cardiologists, is heart disease. And when we take a look at what our doctors are eating, it's not a whole food plant-based diet, and they're not promoting it.
And on that note, I'm going to just say, on behalf of Ben, Judith, and myself, so much thanks for spending the time. Hopefully at some point down the road, you come back and talk to us some more about all the new research that's going out there. That work for you?
Absolutely.
Let's end this up by just making sure that we're clear that we're taking a break in August. We'll be back with our next episode in September. It'll be promoted on our Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram channels. If you want to watch us again, the show is going to be posted. So on behalf of Judith and Ben, I'm Jim Spellos. I'm wishing you optimal health and the best of summers. Take care, everybody. See you in September, as the song goes.